You're listening to Founders on Air with Steve Orenstein and Mike Rosenbaum.
This podcast is sponsored by Zoom to You, Australia's on-demand courier marketplace. Get your parcels delivered within hours rather than days.
So today we have with us Brett Lesperance, CEO of Dauntless Air, a US-based company. Dauntless Air is the largest US operator of the Fireboss aircraft, which provide initial attack of fire suppression for wildfires. So given the bushfire season here in Australia, I thought take a slightly different tact in this episode, and we'd look at sort of how technology and what's happening outside of Australia in terms of assisting in fighting bushfires. To give you some context, today in December 2019, in New South Wales, we have about 98 bushfires across New South Wales, with 50 of them still to be contained. So thanks so much, Brett, for joining us today. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, happy to be here. Great to chat.
Excellent. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and before, I guess, you got started at Dauntless Air?
Sure. So most of the last 15 years of my life, 15 years of my professional life or so, I've been in the private equity industry, specifically oftentimes in the role of finding companies to buy, pulling off the transaction, and then ensuring that they're heading in the right direction. Sometimes these were turnarounds, sometimes they're growth opportunities, but almost in every case, they were on the smaller end of the middle market, companies that had revenues from $20 to $400 million in that range. And, the big part of any of these companies is, regardless of the industry, was always getting the people part of it right. Because if you can get the people part of it right, you tend to end up having a better chance of succeeding in general. So, over that time frame, it's probably been, heavily involved in 17, 18, maybe even 20 companies in that kind of role.
Yeah, excellent. And what made you join Dauntless Air and become the CEO there?
I had been at Bain Capital for almost straight up 9 years. But, that had been a great opportunity. I'd learned a lot, still have a lot of connections there. But what I had missed in continuing to develop my skill set in the private equity world was the operating experience that I'd had earlier in my career, where I was running companies and growing them, and this opportunity it sort of approached me, dug into the industry a little bit, and came to find out that the opportunity within the industry I thought was pretty interesting. There was a growing problem, as you guys are experiencing in Australia, as we're experiencing here in the States, that I think the right platform, the right tactic, and the right approach, we could alter or slow down that challenge. And I didn't see that there was a lot of dynamic thinking that had been applied to the problem in the States, and that we might be able to tackle that challenge. And just to clarify how I jumped into it, I had turned around a helicopter operator in the Gulf of Mexico while I was at Bain Capital, so I'd gotten my feet wet in the aviation space in a 7-year stint, turning that business around. I ran it for a little bit of time, but hired a team to run it over time, and had learned all the things not to do when you're running an aviation company. So I've been prepared. Yeah, right. Excellent.
And so tell us a little bit about Dauntless Air and sort of what you guys do.
So Dauntless Air is based in Minnesota. We have 13 aircraft, 12 of which are the Fireboss aircraft, which is air tractor fuselage and combined with whip air floats and a fantastic Pratt & Whitney engine. And we provide aerial firefighting services to states and the federal entities here in the United States, all across the western part of the United States, Alaska as well. And more and more these days, states like Texas, who haven't used Firebosses in the past, that are. We're about 65 people in the middle of the fire season in total team.
Yeah, right.
And, I think what is unique about the business is that we are very specific to the platform we're utilizing. We don't have helicopters. We don't have large air tankers. We try to stay focused, much like the old Southwest Airlines business model, where stay focused on one platform that provides a fantastic value to the customer in both water dropping capability as well as cost, and promote that. So that's where we focus our efforts.
Yeah, okay. And how does it compare sort of in a different way to, say, use of helicopters or other aircraft?
Yeah, so actually helicopters and Firebosses actually work very well together. And just to paint the picture, as you might imagine, and you guys are seeing quite a few aircraft in your own skies right now, there are a wide variety of different types of aircraft. You have large air tankers, which are typically multi-engines. You've got Firebosses like our aircraft, you've got wheeled aircraft, single engine aircraft that are air tractors that, just drop one load of retardant at a time. And then you have a variety of large helicopters, that's of course these sky cranes and such, all the way down to the smaller bells. But we really think about the part of the fleet or the portfolio part of the portfolio of aerial firefighting aircraft as either scooping or picking up with Bambi buckets or to some extent. So in both cases, helicopters and the Fireboss need to find scoopable water or a source of water where they can either drop a bucket into it or, drop a hose in and suck the water up into the fuselage. And the Fireboss will, needs to find a larger body of water because it lands on the water for about 15 seconds, scoops up 800 gallons of water and takes off and goes back to the fire at hand. So we think that type of aircraft is very unique because, you never need to go back to a base to reload retardant or water. Typically, retardant is what most people are using, but you can leave the base and one of our Firebosses go out for a 3.5 to 4 hour fuel cycle and never have to go back to the base to load up again. And that allows you to stay close to the fire. And, comparing the cost of the DC-10, which you guys have down there, 10 Tanker provides that. It's a great company, great aircraft, plays a very specific role, but one Fireboss can drop as much or more water in an hour as a DC-10 can at about 1/8 to 1/10 the cost.
Yeah, right.
Just because we can continue to go back and forth. And for states who struggle here in this country, in the United States, to find the budget to contract with large air tanker providers or large helicopter providers, companies like ours that have the Fireboss provide a product that is cheap enough, yet firefighting effective enough that it makes sense for them.
Yeah, interesting. And does it always have to be freshwater, or can it be saltwater that can be picked up?
No, it can be saltwater. Quite often when we're in Alaska and we're working along the coast, we'll scoop saltwater. It requires a different cleanout process at the end of every day, and obviously you'd like to avoid saltwater corrosion as much as you can, but oftentimes that will be the closest water source, and that's where we're gonna pull from.
Yeah, okay, interesting. And how do you see sort of fighting fires today versus what was done sort of 10, 20 years ago? Is there much difference in terms of that?
Yes, yeah, there is. I've now been in the industry here about 3 years, and I've become close with a wide variety of folks who have been fighting this challenge for decades. And some of these, most of the folks that I've run into are somewhere based in California or the West. And I've become quite friendly with the former fire chief for Santa Barbara County in California. Great guy, 33 years in the business. He retired a few years back. And I called him last year to catch up over the holidays, just about this time, to say hello. And he had been pulled back in to work the Mendocino complex fire in California. And this is a guy who's usually very up and very chipper. And when I got him on the phone, I could sense some frustration in his voice. And I said, help me understand that, Pat. And he said, I got to tell you this, Brett. He says, 2 decades ago, me and my colleagues, we felt like, every time we took on a wildfire, there was a chance to win the fight. It was sort of fun, and oftentimes we did win the battle. You get ahead of a fire, but he says the fires we're seeing today in the last 5 or 10 years, it's just an entirely different animal. Our forests here are now set up in a way that they become tinder boxes, and we don't win the battles anymore. We don't win the fights. And he says, his point was, more often than not, we're just trying to contain it, corral it, and make sure, as few people as possible get hurt or killed. But he was really, frustrated. And unfortunately, while the fire environment has become much more challenging, and the fire beast that we're battling here in the States is a different beast than it was 2 decades ago. Not every fire agency in the United States is responding in a way to adapt to it. The Forest Service, I don't want to call them into question. They provide a great service, but there still is a mindset there, fighting these fires like we did 10 or 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And CAL FIRE, the California Fire Agency, again, which is a great organization. Go talk to a handful of folks in California and ask them how happy they are with the response times in California from CAL FIRE, and they're not happy either. So there are states in this country that are doing very progressive things. Washington State is, Idaho is, as well as Alaska, because people have become real frustrated and tired of the old way of doing things, and they've decided to approach wildfire mitigation and containment in a different way, and it's working.
Yeah, right.
So that's what I try to continue to push, and it's changing because it has to. I joke sometimes, unfortunately, sort of dark humor with folks in California. When I go to Washington, D.C., I talk to Congress people in D.C. from the state of California, and I say, if we don't change the game in California, California will be a beautiful national park in 2 decades. It'll be a great place to mountain bike and jog, but you won't be able to get electricity or insurance to have a home there.
Yeah, right. And so what do you think's changed to make the sort of wildfires a lot worse?
Wide variety of things. It boils down to, I guess, a couple. Before coming into this industry, I wasn't a climate change denier or supporter. I think all of us see that the world has changed. Years are hotter, summers are hotter.
Yeah.
Relative humidity points are lower than they ever were before. Before I jumped into into running the company, a lot of the research I did was, what is happening to the fire season. Fire season today in the United States is 3 months longer than it was in the early 80s. So you've got this weather event, regardless of how it's been driven, that is creating hotter, longer summers, drier summers. And you tie that into the way that many forests in the United States have been managed, where for much of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was a battle between, the idea of cutting forests down, for timber, for home building and the such, and in wood consumption in general. That interest banged heads right up against the environmentalists' interest of saving every tree in the forest, and it became a state by state thing to a great extent. But the forests were they were able to grow into a very sort of, it's a congested, very tight forest in a lot of spots here in the United States now, where if you walk into the forest, it's hard to walk through the forest unless there's a trail, because trees have been able to grow so close to each other. And when you look up to the sky, you really can't see it in a lot of the forests here in the United States, because it's a very congested canopy.
Yeah, okay.
And
so
when
so
that
much
canopy
fuel.
becomes very dry and very hot, and you get a fire start from a lightning strike or something a mile away, it gets to the canopy, and you've got a 20 knot or 25 knot wind blowing this direction. It really is like a matchbook. You flip open the end of the matches, you light one end, and you just see the flame tear across to the other side of the matchbook, and that replicates itself pretty quickly here in a typical season.
Yeah, right. So in the aircrafts that you run, sort of what sort of technology are you using sort of to assist, and how important is sort of speed of getting to that fire location?
Yeah, so as I explained earlier, the uniqueness of the aircraft and its ability to scoop and go back and forth to the fire very quickly is probably what gives us 75 or 80% of our benefit, quite honestly. To be able to get to a fire at 140 to 150 knots, you scoop very quickly, get back to the fire, drop the load, and continue to do so, for 3.5 hours. That technology alone, based on the inherent design of the aircraft, is probably 75, 80% of the value or the benefit of the aircraft. We've taken a real innovative approach to doing everything we can to upgrade the aircraft in a way that allows it to be that much more effective. We use an aftermarket fire gate, which actually holds the water that we drop, and that's 300 pounds lighter than the manufacturer's gate. Okay. So that allows us to carry that much more water. We also have infrared on all of our aircraft, which allows our pilots to see the hot spots before they drop. Oftentimes, where the smoke is coming from when you're looking down on a fire isn't exactly where the hot spot is, or the current flames are. And oftentimes, the ground crews are asking us to, what do you see? Can you make sure you put it right on the leading edge of the fire? So it allows us to be that much more accurate with our drops. But it also is a safety measure for our pilots, because oftentimes, you might imagine, you're flying low and slow, not that at about 110, 120 knots. You're flying through a smoke-filled environment, so the infrared camera allows our pilots to see the fire better, drop more accurately, but also be safer flying in and out of that space. The other thing we've added to our aircraft, the ability to do onboard mixing of different water enhancers. So that's also unique to our Fireboss fleet. We can inject, it's just an Australian-based company, it's a product called Blaze Tamer. I forget the name of the parent company,
Okay.
but they make a very effective water enhancer that can carry enough of it in a concentrated form in the aircraft, and for almost 20 complete scoops, which is which is a good chunk of our fuel cycle, three and a half hours or so, we can put in just enough of that Blaze Tamer every time we drop a load. That actually helps keep water. It helps make water more effective. It helps keep water cooler on the trees and the bush on the ground longer and cooler, and it's a pretty effective product. So that capability is used by some of the states here in the United States. Some others decide not to use it. But those two things, the infrared and the onboard gel mixing, combined with a lighter gate, allows our aircraft to be that much more effective. And we're always assessing what is the next great technology we could add to the aircraft. And there is a lot of new technology out there when it comes to early detection abilities that we're thinking about adding to the aircraft in the years to come.
Yeah, okay. Excellent. And how do you get alerted if there's a fire that you've got to go to?
How do you get what? I'm sorry?
Alerted to knowing that there's a fire that's just occurred.
Oh, yeah. So oftentimes, we'll be positioned in a state. There's a variety of different. We can work from any base that has a 2,500 foot runway or more, which is a lot of different air bases. But oftentimes, we are contracted by the state or the federal fire agency and told we need you here. We think this is going to be one of the more fire-prone areas of this state. And there's a variety of new detection technologies out there that the Forest Service and others are using, where they see these fire starts. Oftentimes, there'll be electric lightning overnight, and that'll start a variety of fires the next day. Oftentimes, they try to suppress the fires earlier in the day with ground troops, because that's when the wind is typically not as bad. But oftentimes, if they can't suppress it completely, and the wind picks up, that's when they start bringing the different type of aircraft in. The request will come from an incident commander who's working a fire, and he will decide what kind of assets he'd like to have on the fire for that day's effort, and he will bring in helicopters and request large air tankers and fire bosses. And in some cases, those assets are in the area, and we'll get a dispatch to go to the fire. In some cases, they're not in the area, and he'll say, well, what else? Or she'll say, he or she will say, what else can we get? So it's a pretty quick process once they decide, that they want to bring in certain types of aircraft. The incident commander gets a hold of the dispatcher, and there's typically an aircraft manager at every base. And that dispatch will go to that base manager, and pretty quickly that gets sent to our pilots at that base to respond to a certain fire at a certain location. And we try to be, at the end of the runway in 4 minutes and off the ground in 6 to respond to a fire. And we're, depending how far we have to run, we're typically on a fire within the first 30 or 40 minutes of being called.
Yeah, right. Wow.
And that's very, very, very important to help slow down any fire.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, excellent. And what does it look like in terms of cost of people hiring the planes?
So every aircraft has a different cost profile, but our pricing, again, I'm slightly biased, but if you look at a large air tankers, the ones that are dropping a little retardant, the ones that look like they are commercial airliners that have been converted into firefighting aircraft. Those aircraft can, there's two ways we get paid. We get paid for having an aircraft there on the ground, ready to respond, and we get paid for every hour we fly. And those large air tankers oftentimes will be anywhere from $20,000 to $30,000 a day just to have it sitting there, ready to go. And the flight time is anywhere between, $12,000 per hour and $20,000 per hour, depending on what the aircraft is. So it's not cheap, as you can see, but a lot of the cost that is in those revenue rates is the cost of the asset, which is not cheap, the cost of the pilots, the cost of the fuel, cost of the mechanics and ground crews. So it's an expensive it's an expensive endeavor to hire those large air tankers and oftentimes the larger helicopters. At our end of the spectrum, where we've got smaller aircraft, they're single engine, they're less costly to purchase. They're relatively, I won't call it simple, but they're the complexity of a Fireboss compared to the complexity of a 737 are very different type of aircraft to manage. So we are able to price our aircraft to somewhere in the $4,500 a day and $4,500 an hour range, which you can see where the cost differences add up pretty quickly. And that's, in my mind, that's a very appropriate value to the customer. It also allows us to run our business, in a manner where we can hire and retain really talented pilots and crew chiefs and mechanics and keep them in our business. As you may be experiencing in Australia, we're definitely experiencing here in the United States. The three main employee types, team member types that we hire here in the States are pilots, mechanics, and crew chiefs, which are typically, over the road, large, heavy truck operators. Pilots in this country are in high demand, so we've got to make sure we are hiring and, paying those folks correctly. Mechanics are in high demand in this country as well as over the road truckers. And so challenging buckets of employees to recruit and hold on to, but feel like we're doing it in a way that is keeping people here for the long term.
Yeah, makes sense. And you think about those costs, and you think about the cost of the damage that the bushfires are doing to properties and all sorts of things. It sounds significantly cheaper than the cost of all the destruction that the bushfires do. I oftentimes I'm frustrated here in the States because you can ask a 12-year-old child what's a better way to put out a fire. Is it easier to dump a 5-gallon bucket of water on a small fire at your feet that is a few inches in diameter, or is it easier to wait a while, take that same 5-gallon bucket and wait for the fire to be 30 meters by 30 meters? Absolutely.
And the 12-year-old will say, well, it's obvious, but if you ask certain fire agencies in this country, it's not as obvious. And no one wants the devastation to occur. No one wants people to lose their lives or their homes or their properties. But the way that we all decide to respond to fires is the real challenge. In my mind, and if you've seen any of the materials at our website, it's all about response times. It's being able to identify a fire quickly and get on that fire as fast as possible and to put out the fire as quickly as possible. And that's not every fire. People say, well, you can't put out every fire, Brett. That'll just lead to the same challenges we're having in our forests already. And I agree. Fire is a naturally occurring event that is actually it promotes forest health over the long term. But what I'm trying to change people's minds on is that it's not about putting out every fire. Let the fires that will not harm people or harm property do what they do best. But unfortunately, these days there's so many homes and properties and people living in this what we call the wildland urban interface that weren't living there 2 or 3 decades ago. They expect to be protected, and they should. And so those are unwanted. Those are unwanted fires. Suppress them quickly. Put them out quickly, and then you can manage the way you're going to improve the health of that forest through prescribed burns and appropriate forest thinning. The state of Washington has saved hundreds of millions of dollars per year and significantly reduced devastation in their state because they have a policy of not letting any wildfire get to be larger than 10 acres in size and or suppressed in one day. And that mindset has shifted the last 4 seasons, and they've moved to using fire bosses in the state. And they burned almost 1 million acres in 2015. They spent almost $600 million. They lost 3 firefighters. They died, unfortunately. And they basically said that's it, we're done. And they were fighting fires what I call the old-fashioned way. Send ground crews to try to contain the fire. If that doesn't work, call in for the heavy large air tankers, and hopefully we can contain this fire and control it and won't hurt anyone too badly. Well, that's not working anymore. So now they basically see smoke and they send 2 fire bosses and one of their state-owned helicopters, and we leave the air base loaded with water. We dump, right when we get there, we start dumping water on the fire. We pummel it to a point that we can contain it, keep it cool, keep it small, and then the ground crews show up and they actually put the fire out. The planes rarely put the fire out; they just keep it smaller and keep it contained. And since that shift, since that horrible 2015 season, they are now spending somewhere between 100 and 150 million dollars a year. They're burning somewhere between 70,000 acres and 150,000 acres a year. They've significantly reduced the stress on their wildland firefighters. They've been able to not only recruit firefighters but retain them because the job has become less taxing and dangerous than it was before. And the real positive outcome is that the state has spent so much less on actually putting the fires out. They now have the money in their budget to do the things that'll slow down this wildfire threat, which is prescribed burns and appropriate forest thinning in the winter months. And they're making their whole entire their state has become a much healthier forest environment because of this new strategy. And it's just, again, a very obvious response to this wildfire challenge, and it's progressive and it's on the leading edge. The woman there who is the commissioner of public lands, a woman by the name of Hillary Franz, very smart, very dynamic, didn't know a lot about fire before she got elected into the role in early 2016. But I met her a few summers ago, and I said, boy, I really, really thank you for being so progressive. And she said, well, what do you mean? I said, I told her the differences between the way she manages fire in her state and what other states manage it. And she said that doesn't seem to make sense, because in my mind, Brett, it makes dollars and cents, and it makes common sense to do it this way.
Yeah. So
why I chuckled. I said, I'd love to take you to other states to tell the tale. And she's actually been helpful in that way. And we've worked together in meeting with other folks. But it's again, ask a 12-year-old how to put a fire out, and they'll have the answer for you. But, I think as we get to be adults and bureaucracies grow in a certain ways, we react to challenges differently.
It seems so obvious. Why do you think people don't see it as obviously as that?
I think everyone sees that we've got the challenge is different than it was, but I do think in a country like ours, right? We've been fighting fires with aircraft for 3 or 4 decades, and there's been a lot of money invested in the infrastructure to do so. There are roughly 30 large air tankers in the United States that fight fires every year, which is a relatively small number of aircraft, but they're expensive, and so using them the way we used to use them and continue to do so is we got to continue to support that fleet. I also think there are a lot of people who are very good at being wildland firefighters in the summer, right? When we have fire season here, that's their job. And so there's tens of thousands of folks in this country that fight wildfires in the summer. And there's a fear that I think if you respond to fires too quickly and put them out, you might put those people out of work. And I don't think that's entirely correct. I think there are jobs that these people could have year round. We're not going to stop the fire threat altogether. I think we're going to change the way we fight it. But I just think we're up against sort of a lot of legacy thinking that has been this is the way we've been fighting fires for the last 30 years. It works, and until you sort of flip the mindset there and you look at the way that we've got to adapt to it, it's change is never easy, especially in government agencies, and so it's coming along, but it's coming along slowly. So I wish I had a good answer for you on that topic, but I do think there's a labor component as well as a asset sort of infrastructure component that if we change the way we've been fighting fires, guys, we may need to change the reality of the situation. We may not need certain types of aircraft as much as we do now. We may need less people in the middle of the fire season fighting fires, and I think that weighs on some folks' decisions on how we do this.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. And so I'm sure everyone's sort of wondering, do you operate outside of the US? Can you come to Australia?
We can. We can come to Australia. We can send our aircraft over there and work those fires, and we love to.
How long
we
would
are
that
NAFTA registered.
How long would that take?
Sorry. So a single engine air tanker that cruises at about 140 knots is at a disadvantage as compared to a 737 flying from the
Yeah.
States to Australia. But it can happen relatively quickly. We weren't in direct conversations with any Australian government officials, but we know some of the operators down there, and you have a few Fireboss operators down there for sure.
Yeah, right.
So I think there's 3 or 4, maybe 5 Firebosses in the country, but we know those guys well, and they asked us to get ready to ship the aircraft over there because your government fire agencies were in conversation with them, asking them, what else or what other aircraft may be out there that you get your hands on. So we are ready to go. It would think if we were given the green light, in the next, say tomorrow, for instance, we could probably be there within a week's time. Just to be safe, conservative on that front, probably not any faster, but for sure within a week. There is a bit of a challenge because we do end up flying the aircraft from California to Hawaii to where you guys are. At a certain point in the winter, the trade winds work against us, and the flight becomes more and more dangerous.
Yeah. Okay.
So we're running up against that in the next month or so. And there are companies out there. We wouldn't fly the aircraft ourselves. There are guys out there who that's their job of getting single engine aircraft from the United States to Australia and into Asia. That's a risky business, and I'm glad those guys are out there. But we could be there within a week.
Yeah, right. Awesome.
If need be.
And so, what advice
Be happy to help.
would you give to any sort of government people in Australia sort of thinking about this or thinking about sort of what else they can do? And so from your experience and speaking with sort of some of the other states.
I haven't really studied how folks in Australia, the fire agency folks in Australia think about and react to fires. So I don't know what you are and aren't doing. I guess it would be, you guys also don't, I don't think, you can tell me otherwise, you guys have the same legacy mindset on legacy mindset and infrastructure that has been built here in the States on thinking about responding to wildfires. So I don't know how many aircraft you have in the country and how you guys utilize them, but I think I'll say this much, not knowing exactly what's there. Yeah. I don't think anyone can argue against the idea that responding to fires more quickly, suppressing them more quickly has its advantages. You think of the analog I like to talk to people about when I'm trying to explain this is, until the 80s or so, a lot of commercial large buildings didn't have fire sprinklers in them. And you go into any building, any commercial building or hotel here in the United States now, or any office building, and they all have to be water sprinkled, right? So they all have these little discs in the ceiling. And so what I tell people is that prior to these sprinklers, you had the way that we responded to the structure fires was you called the 911, and the fire truck that's 2 miles from the building has a $1.5 million fire truck in it that holds 3,500 gallons of water and can pump 350 gallons of water per minute. You'd call them, they'd be there in 5 to 10 minutes, and hopefully they'd be in your office in another 5 or 10 minutes. And most likely, that conference room you're sitting in, as they tell the story, would probably be burnt to a crisp. If we couldn't get out, we might have been killed, or we might have a lot of smoke damage done to our lungs. But that's the way that I think of the Forest Service is reacting these days. But I often now use this example. I tell people to look up to the ceiling. You see those 5 or 6 discs in the ceiling. Think of those as Firebosses or any other fast response, smaller, less expensive type of aircraft. And they're sitting there ready to go. And the minute they sense fire, you respond within 30 seconds or 45 seconds with the water sprinkler, which is pumping out, anywhere from, 5 gallons, maybe 8 gallons per minute at most. It just isn't as sexy as the big expensive fire truck down the street. It's a lot less expensive, and it puts out a lot less water, but it does so quickly and it does so efficiently. And so in that same conference room, the fire started on the conference table. That sprinkler head would probably contain it within, just burning maybe the top of the table. None of us would lose our lives, and we wouldn't have a lot of smoke damage to our lungs. So, smaller, less costly, fast attack aircraft getting on a fire quickly versus the old model. I just don't think anyone can argue against that. And then the money you save in doing so, allows you to have the time and the money to do the things that are really going to slow down this threat. And I would mention them, but I'll do it again. Prescribe burn things when you want to, when you control it. And then, let's not clear cut the woods. Here in the United States, there's this thinking that, well, everyone wants, if we let people do the forest thing, they're going to clear cut all the woods. Well, we've come a long way from where we were 100 years ago in thinking about logging in this country, in the United States. There are ways to appropriately thin forests to make them healthier, but also to take wood product out of those forests and turn them into something that building products or other items. And those are the things that are actually going to slow down this threat. I don't think we can stop it, but what can we do to slow it down over time?
Yeah, makes sense. Absolutely. And what do you see in sort of future technology and things that you think will come out in the future around sort of assisting further?
Try to do quite a bit of thinking around this one. There will be a time in the future where drones will be part of the aerial firefighting complex. They already are part of the reconnaissance efforts here in the United States. They're not using a lot of them, but the obvious benefits of drone technology are trying to be applied here. But my thinking is, well, what's been interesting to watch is the ability to predict and detect. To predict where fire behavior may occur and then, detect it quickly. There are a lot of interesting technologies that have already been developed or are being developed to do that kind of thing. So where in this state, over the next week, has it been hotter than usual? Is it drier than usual? And where we predicted to have storms coming in, lightning storms. So the idea of, okay, this upper right-hand, the northeastern side of Washington state is really, 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 really fire prone, so we should move some assets in that direction.
Yeah,
fantastic technology there, and the ability now to once a fire starts to detect it while it's small, that is also developing really quickly. Where the disconnect seems to be happening is how quickly we respond to it, and I've already talked a lot about that with you, so I'm not going to go back to that. But I think the future of where we should be heading is that that early detection equipment, and we're looking at this right now. The early detection equipment should be on the aircraft, and if I had my druthers, and they do some of this in Spain actually with fire bosses, they do loaded patrols. They send up 2 fire bosses at a time on very, very, sort of high risk fire days at the worst part of the day. And they send them up there in pairs, loaded, and they look for smoke while they're floating around, up there for 3.5, 4 hours at a time. When they see smoke, they drop down and they start working the fire right away. I think, if we were to head in a certain direction here in the United States, you put early detection equipment on aircraft like fire bosses. You put them up in the sky, sort of on patrols. You combine the satellite-based capability of predicting where fire areas might be at highest risk in the state. Then you put loaded patrols in that part of the state, flying during the day. And with the right detection equipment on those aircraft, you could get to a fire before it gets any larger than, a couple yards very quickly. And you knock it down. In that case, you could put out a fire with a couple fire bosses without even having ground crews show up to do so.
Yeah, right.
So to me, it's very much, I do think we need to move more towards a military type of response in this country when it comes to fighting fires. I visited the folks who live in Paradise, California, after the Camp Fire last year, and I interviewed more than a handful of folks, and one woman really caught my attention when she said, when is this country going to start thinking about wildfires as a national security risk, or national security threat? Because if terrorists had come into Paradise in Chico, California, and killed almost 100 people and burned almost 20,000 structures, wouldn't our best and brightest military minds, be fighting back?
Totally.
And I couldn't disagree with her. She hit it right on the head. And I think we need to head in that direction. And I think, it's not just a concept. I think the pieces of the puzzle are staring right at people's faces. In some states are getting it, and others are, coming a little more slowly. But it is a serious threat, and it is killing people every year. It's destroying properties. It's killing off livestock, and it's also, there is a lot of value in the timber in this country. And you burn a tree so badly, you can't harvest that timber. So long-winded explanation to your question, but I think the technology's out there, the tactics need to change, but it doesn't it's not something that has to be developed to succeed. All the pieces are already there.
Yeah, right. In some ways, that's exciting to hear that there's this technology that can actually make a significant difference in this, which is nice.
Yeah. No, it's what's made this. My three, almost, I guess, coming up on 3 years here of being involved in this business, in this industry. There's a real tangible problem that not just the United States is dealing with, but the globe is dealing with now. There are tangible solutions to it, and everyone agrees that we need to do something about it. And it's an exciting and interesting problem to help solve. And I think over the next decade, there'll be a lot of progress in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, changing tax now, and just going back to our core focus usually of what we talk about on this podcast. So as you've had a lot of experience in private equity as an investor. What are the sort of key things that you look for in sort of when you're looking to make an investment into a business or to acquire a business?
Oh boy, that's a whole entire extra podcast. I've invested in a wide variety of different size companies in a wide variety of different industries, and I'm trying to think of what are the consistent themes I'm looking for. Oftentimes before, almost every time, we invest in something, whether it's a growth situation or it's a turnaround situation, we'll do a blind market survey to help us understand how that company is perceived in the marketplace. And we won't ask specifically about that company. We'll ask about it and its competitors. And what I'm hoping to get out of those conversations, you talk to customers and suppliers in that industry, which is some industries it's easier to do this than others. What you're hoping to find is that within those conversations, are there 3 or 4 things that company is either doing very well or is doing poorly, but it's important to the industry that we can build the future success off of that business. So that's you might think I'm trying to wiggle out of the answer to the question, but it's oftentimes, I've got to get a sense of what the marketplace thinks about this business and how we would change the strategy going forward. And if that's a set of facts that we think we can actually get our minds around and solve over a 3 to 6 year window, then that is sort of the first step. And from there, it's the people model, it's the structure of the balance sheet. What are the things that we can alter for the better? And in some cases, oftentimes, sadly enough, an opportunity, you can quickly see that there's really, it's almost a company that doesn't need to exist. The most important question you always have to ask yourself in these businesses, especially on the smaller end of the middle market, where they don't have sort of a global footprint or maybe oftentimes a national footprint, is if the company wasn't here tomorrow, would anyone care? There are enough competitors out there beating each other up that if one went away, it wouldn't matter. And oftentimes that is the case. And sadly enough, sometimes we've made investments and really hadn't gotten that answer correct and find out the wrong way. But oftentimes, if you ask yourself that question and you can't come up with a good answer, then you probably need to move on to the next opportunity.
Yeah, okay. That's a good answer. And thinking about sort of founders and entrepreneurs who have started companies, has there been sort of common mistakes that you see founders sort of making?
I don't have the real experience of doing a startup or starting something from scratch. So it may be an unfair question for me to answer, but what I know I've seen in many of the companies that I've been part of or we've invested in is, as I mentioned this to you earlier, if you can't get the people part right, you're probably going to have a less likely chance of succeeding. And oftentimes, unfortunately, getting the people part right means letting go of people that you initially thought were going to work out well, and oftentimes we replace or upgrade a certain role probably more slowly than we should. And once you've made a decision to move on to let someone go and hire a new person in that position, you almost always look back on that decision and say, we probably should have done that a year ago.
Yeah.
Oftentimes problem employees are the easy ones to figure out. The real challenges are the people who have the right attitudes and they're trying very hard, but the job or the role has just grown well past them over time. And you want them to succeed and you do everything you can to get them to succeed. But oftentimes it's just most likely not going to happen. And so, I use a term and I don't use it lightly, but if you can't change the people, eventually you need to change the people.
Yeah.
And, you focus on training and educating a person in a role that you really like to see if they can catch up with where the organization's heading. But oftentimes it doesn't work, as well as you'd hope it would. And you do need to move on from that person. And when you do so, you try to do so in the most fair and equitable way when that person has done everything they can. But that would be something that I'm guessing happens in startups, and as well as happens in middle market companies and larger companies.
Yeah, it's always very hard having to let go of someone. You might like them and you might think they're doing an okay job, but the role may have grown as the company has grown. So it's always challenging.
Yeah, those are the tough ones. Those are the ones you lose a lot of sleep over, and hopefully you're doing the right thing. You always got to do the right thing for the company. If you're an officer or a director of the company, you have a fiduciary duty to do what's right for the business long term. And sometimes it's making hard decisions like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the final question: what's your thoughts on the US economy at the moment and sort of the outlook for 2020?
Oof, jeez. There's a lot of divisiveness in this country, as I'm sure you guys can see from our daily news feeds, and that's uncomfortable and it's not fun to watch. But I do think the underlying fundamentals in the economy here in the States are relatively solid for 2020. Oftentimes bad things don't happen in election years, so no one wants to make any drastic moves in any one direction if things are heading in the right direction. I think we'll be okay for 2020. I think depending on the outcome of the election, next November, that may turn the outcome one way or the other, for 2021. But for 2020, it's an easy prediction for me to make as someone who isn't as well informed on this as I should be. I'm not an economist.
Yeah.
I'm not sitting in Washington D.C. making critical decisions. But knock on wood, we will sort of continue to just trundle along like we are now. But it is unfortunate to see the divisiveness, that we are experiencing in Washington D.C. Regardless of what side, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, I think almost every American is sort of sick of the daily barrage going back and forth.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much for your time and all your insights that you've shared. I think a lot of people are going to find this a really interesting podcast to listen to. So thanks so much, Brett.
Oh, great. Yeah, no, I appreciate you reaching out and look forward to hearing it. Never like to hear my own voice, but it'll be interesting to listen to. So, hey, thanks for the time, Stephen, and happy holidays. And if you or anyone else out there wants to talk more, you can find us through our website. So, thank you.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Brett. Appreciate it.
Have a good one. Thank you. Take care.
Cheers. Thanks.
This podcast is sponsored by Parkhound, Australia's parking marketplace. To find a convenient parking space near your home or office.
You've been listening to Founders on Air with Steve Orenstein and Mike Rosenbaum, a podcast designed for founders by founders to help you scale your business. For show notes and to ask questions for future episodes, go to foundersonair.com. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you next time.